She had closed 47 deals in 9 years and never once walked away empty-handed. But the man standing at the edge of the cornfield didn't flinch when she named her price. He didn't counter. He didn't negotiate. He just looked at her the way people look at someone who doesn't yet understand what they're about to lose. And then he said 7 words that stopped her cold. "You'll be poisoning 400 families' water." Vanessa Holloway had built her entire career on certainty, on numbers, projections, pressure, and precision. She had never met an obstacle she couldn't price her way through. She had never met Landon Pierce. If this story reaches you, like this video, drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning Vanessa Holloway drove into Creston Valley, Tennessee, she had already decided how the day would end. She'd reviewed the file on the flight from Chicago. 340 acres of rural farmland, partially wooded, sitting on what the Holloway Mead Corporation's geotechnical team had assessed as ideal ground for a mixed-use development project. Residential subdivisions, a commercial strip, possibly a distribution center on the east parcel. The kind of project that didn't make headlines but made careers. Her career specifically, which was already a thing people in commercial real estate talked about with a particular mix of admiration and mild resentment. 47 acquisitions, 9 years, 0 losses. She'd bought mountain land from a stubborn old cattleman in Colorado by listening to him talk about his late father for 4 hours, and then making an offer that honored what the land had meant to the family while still landing inside Holloway Mead's target margin. She'd acquired waterfront property in Georgia from a widow who didn't even want to sell until Vanessa sat across from her at a kitchen table and showed her in real numbers what her children stood to inherit. She wasn't cruel about it. She wasn't soft about it either. She was just good. The kind of good that came from understanding that people didn't sell land. They sold whatever story they'd been telling themselves about it. Creston Valley looked like dozens of other places she'd been. The highway gave way to a 2-lane county road, and the county road gave way to something barely wider than a generous driveway. Soybean fields on both sides, then a tree line, then a long stretch of fence posts with barbed wire rusting at the joints. The GPS lost confidence about 12 miles out and started suggesting she make a U-turn every few minutes. She ignored it. She'd learned early on that satellite systems weren't built with rural Tennessee in mind. The farm came into view around a bend. White clapboard house, 2 stories. The kind of place that had probably been painted and repainted so many times the layers were structural at this point. A barn off to the left, red fading to rust brown. A tractor parked near an equipment shed with its hood open. And in front of all of it, standing in the gravel drive like he'd been expecting her for exactly as long as it took her to get there, was Landon Pierce. She pulled her rented Audi to a stop and took a breath. The file had included a photo, county property record headshot, the kind nobody looks good in. But Landon Pierce looked different in person. Mid-30s, she guessed, though the file said 32. He had the kind of build that came from physical work rather than a gym, wide across the shoulders, with calloused hands she noticed when he reached out to shake hers. His face was weathered enough to suggest he spent most of his time outdoors, but his eyes were sharp in a way that didn't match the overalls and the cracked work boots. That was the first thing she filed away. The eyes. "Ms. Holloway." His voice was even, not cold, not warm. "Mr. Pierce." She matched it. "Thanks for agreeing to meet." Didn't have much choice. He said it without bitterness, just matter of fact. When a corporation sends certified letters for 6 months, eventually you meet with their person. She almost smiled. Almost. He didn't invite her inside, which she noted. Instead, he tilted his head toward the far edge of the property and started walking. She followed, her heels immediately finding every divot in the gravel, and made a quiet internal note to wear different shoes next time. They walked in silence for about 2 minutes, which Vanessa used the way she always used silence in negotiations, reading. The property was well kept. Not pristine, but maintained with obvious intention. The fence lines were repaired where they needed to be. The equipment, what she could see of it, looked old but functional rather than neglected. This wasn't a man who'd given up on the place. This was a man who'd made choices about where to put his energy. He stopped at a low rise at the south end of the property, where the land flattened out into a wide natural basin. In the distance, she could see the rooftops of what looked like a small cluster of farm buildings. Neighbors. That's the Atchison place. Landon said, following her gaze. And past that, the Wellers. The Nguyens bought the old Garfield farm about 4 years back, running cattle now. He paused. 31 family operations within a mile and a half of where you're standing. I appreciate the context, Vanessa said, keeping her voice pleasant. But I'd like to talk about your parcel specifically. Holloway Mead has prepared a very competitive offer. You have kids, Ms. Holloway? The question caught her off guard. Not because it was hostile. He said it the same way he said everything else, level and direct. But because she hadn't been asked that in a negotiation before. No, she said. He nodded like it wasn't a judgment, just a data point. I have a son. He's 6. His name is Oliver. A beat. His mother died 2 years ago, cardiac event. Nobody saw it coming. He said the words carefully, like he'd said them enough times that he'd learned to keep them from doing too much damage on the way out. After that, I came back here. This was my family's land. It made sense. I'm sorry about your wife. Her name was Clara. He looked at her. Oliver has her eyes. Vanessa said nothing. She recognized when someone was drawing a line, and she was smart enough not to mistake it for sentimentality. Mr. Pierce? The Creston Aquifer, he said. You know what that is? She did. It had been in the environmental summary Holloway Mead's team had prepared. An underground freshwater system running beneath the valley, one of the primary water sources for the area's farms and older residential wells. The report had assessed it as posing no significant obstacle to the development plan. It's in our environmental documentation, she said. He crouched down and picked up a handful of soil, turned it over in his palm, then let it fall. The aquifer feeds wells on 36 properties in this valley, not city water, well water, meaning if anything compromises the recharge zone, he gestured broadly at the land around them. Those families lose their water supply. No backup, no municipal connection they can switch to, just dry wells. The environmental assessment was done by Meridian Environmental Partners. He said the name the same way she might say a restaurant she'd gotten food poisoning from. Who has done 9 of the last 12 assessments for Holloway Mead projects nationally? He looked at her directly. You know that? She didn't. She hadn't dug into the vendor relationship. She kept her face neutral. The report was reviewed and cleared. Reviewed by Holloway Mead's internal team. He stood back up and brushed the dirt from his hands. I'm not trying to make this personal. I want you to understand that. You flew out here, you're doing your job, and I get that. He looked out over the valley again. But this isn't a land deal to me. This is water, and not just mine. She studied him. The file had described him as a farmer, full stop, former Tennessee resident, returned to family property following personal circumstances, no current professional affiliations. It hadn't mentioned anything past that. What did you do before you came back here? She asked. He glanced at her sideways, something shifting almost imperceptibly in his expression. Farmed. Before that, a pause. Law? What kind? The pause was longer this time. Environmental. She felt something recalibrate in her chest. Not alarm. Something more like the specific sharpening that happened when she realized a negotiation was something other than what she'd walked into. You practiced environmental law, she said, for 7 years. Mostly federal cases. Clean Water Act violations, land contamination suits, that kind of work. He said it the way someone describes a previous life, not with pride, not with regret, just with the flatness of distance. Then Clara got sick, and then she was gone, and Oliver needed... He stopped. I needed to be here. They stood there for a moment with the wind moving through the soybean field to their left, the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but had weight to it. Vanessa looked out at the basin. She thought about the environmental summary, thought about Meridian Environmental Partners, and 9 of 12 assessments, and the aquifer, and 36 wells. She thought about the number she'd flown down here to put on the table, and she thought about the 47 deals, and she thought about the fact that for the first time in a very long while, she didn't feel the familiar pull of certainty. Mr. Pierce, she said, I'd like to see your water data. He looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something change in those sharp eyes. Not warmth, exactly, more like a door cracking open an inch. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." The inside of the house was not what she expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she'd expected. Not this, anyway. Books in built-in shelves along every wall of the living room, legal volumes stacked on the coffee table alongside picture books about trains, and a half-finished Lego project on the floor near the couch. A child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator. A yellow house surrounded by stick figure trees, and beside it, two stick figures, one tall and one very small, holding hands. She didn't say anything about it. Landon pulled a binder from a shelf, actually several binders, which he stacked on the kitchen table while the coffee brewed, and opened the first one to a section tabbed with a green sticky note. "This is 3 years of groundwater monitoring data," he said. "I've been testing the main recharge zones quarterly. These are independent lab results from the University of Tennessee's Agricultural Extension Program." He flipped to another section. "This is historical data going back 20 years, which the County Environmental Office had on file. And this," he opened a second binder, "is a hydrogeological study conducted in 2019 by a researcher named Dr. Anita Chandra at Vanderbilt. She mapped the full recharge network." He slid the open binder across the table to her. Vanessa set down her coffee and looked. She was not a hydrologist, but she'd been in this industry long enough to read technical documents with reasonable literacy, and what she was looking at showed a recharge zone that was significantly larger than what Meridian's assessment had documented. Substantially larger. The kind of difference that wasn't a rounding error. She looked up at him. "Why didn't you submit this in response to our correspondence?" "I did," he said, "twice, with cover letters." He reached into the front pocket of the first binder and pulled out 2 sheets of paper, copies of certified mail receipts. "I sent hard copies and digital submissions both times. The first was ignored. The second got a form response saying the company had received my letter and that the environmental assessment had been reviewed and found compliant." She stared at the receipts. She had never seen those submissions. Neither of them had been in her file. "I have to be honest with you," she said, before she entirely decided to say it. "I wasn't given this information." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not surprise, not suspicion, just careful assessment, like he was deciding what to do with what she'd just said. "No," he said. "I didn't think you were." Gimant. She drove back to this county road with both windows down, which she rarely did because highway air wasn't good for her hair, and she didn't care. She called Marcus Webb, her assistant, from the car. "The Pierce meeting," she said. "I need everything on the Meridian environmental assessments for Holloway Mead projects in the last 3 years, every report, and I need to know what submissions were logged against the Creston Valley project." "Logged submissions?" Marcus sounded puzzled. "Like correspondence from opposing parties? Residents? Any submissions flagged as objections or counter-evidence?" She paused. "I want to know what was received and what was included in my file." A beat. "Okay. That might take a couple days to pull together. Make it one." She hung up and drove for a while with just the sound of the road and the wind and the long, flat green of Tennessee going past her on both sides. She passed a hand-painted sign at the edge of someone's driveway. "Fresh eggs. Honey, sweet corn. Leave money in the box." She passed a crossroads with a tiny post office the size of a large shed. She passed a woman walking a dog down the shoulder of the road who raised her hand in a wave at Vanessa's car without looking up, the automatic greeting of a place where everyone knew everyone else's vehicle. 400 families, she thought. And then she corrected herself because Landon had said 31 family operations and 36 wells, not 400, and her own mind had rounded up without permission, which was interesting. She thought about the binders. She thought about Dr. Chandra's hydrogeological map and the recharge zone that was 2.5 times the size Meridian had documented. She thought about 2 certified submissions that had never made it into her file. She thought about Oliver and the drawing on the refrigerator, and the way Landon Pierce had said her name was Clara, with the specific steadiness of a man who'd learned to carry grief by holding it still. She had closed 47 deals. She had never, not once, wondered whether the file she'd been given was complete. The motel she'd booked in the nearest town, a place called Harwick, was exactly what it looked like from the outside: clean, competent, and cheerless. She ate dinner at the diner across the road, fried catfish, which she hadn't eaten since a college road trip, and sat in the orange plastic booth with her laptop open and her untouched pie growing a skin on the plate beside her. She pulled up the Meridian Environmental Partners website first. Standard consulting firm boilerplate. Offices in 3 cities. A client list that was impressively general, the kind of vagueness that meant the firm didn't want you looking too closely at who hired them. She went to the SEC filings database next and cross-referenced Holloway Mead's vendor disclosure records. Meridian had been a registered vendor with Holloway Mead since 2018. Between 2018 and the present, they'd completed 14 environmental assessments for Holloway Mead projects in 9 states. She found the Crestone Valley report dated 8 months ago and downloaded it. Then she spent 45 minutes going through it against the data and the photos she'd taken of Landon's binders with her phone. At some point, the waitress refilled her coffee without asking, which she appreciated, and at some point the diner got quiet, and at some point she looked up and realized it was after 10 o'clock, and the place was empty except for her and a man at the counter reading a newspaper who appeared to be asleep. The differences between Meridian's report and Dr. Chandra's hydrogeological study weren't subtle. The recharge zone boundaries in Meridian's report were drawn to a line that conveniently stopped just inside the southern edge of the Pierce property, meaning the development footprint, as currently designed, fell just outside what Meridian had mapped as the protected recharge area. But Dr. Chandra's map, based on 18 months of field measurement and peer-reviewed methodology, put the recharge boundary nearly 900 meters further north, inside the development footprint. Well inside. She sat back. There were explanations, different methodologies, different data sets. Honest professional disagreement between experts happened in environmental science all the time. She knew that. But the 2 submissions Landon had sent, with Dr. Chandra's study attached, had never made it into her file. She picked up her phone and called Richard Gaines. He was the CFO of Holloway Mead and also the internal executive who oversaw the Crestone Valley project. He answered on the 3rd ring, which meant he'd been awake, which at 10:15 on a Tuesday said something. "How'd it go?" he said, without saying hello first, which was standard Richard. "Pierce isn't going to sell," she said. "Not yet. I need more time." "We're on a timeline, Vanessa. Groundbreaking is scheduled." "I know when groundbreaking is scheduled," she kept her voice careful. "Richard, I want to talk about the environmental file. There seem to be some inconsistencies between our Meridian report and independent data that's been submitted by community members." A pause. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "The recharge zone boundaries. They're significantly different from what an independent hydrologist mapped." She waited. "And I understand some of that data was submitted to us directly and wasn't included in the file I was given. Do you know anything about that?" The pause this time was longer and different in quality. "I'll have legal look into it," he said. "You're down there to close a land deal, Vanessa. That's your job. Don't get into the weeds on environmental logistics. That's not your expertise. I'm just trying to make sure our file is complete." "It's complete," he said. The edge in his voice was new. "Close the deal." "That's what I need from you." He hung up. Vanessa set her phone down on the table and looked at the screen until it went dark. "That's not your expertise." She picked up her fork and ate a bite of the pie, which was lemon meringue and was good, and she thought about Richard Gaines, who she had worked with for 6 years, and who had always been exactly as polished and exacting as his suits. And she thought about the new edge in his voice, and she thought about how people only got that edge when they were protecting something. She left a $20 tip because the waitress had refilled her coffee 4 times without making her feel guilty about sitting there, and she walked back across the empty county road to her cheerless, competent motel. She didn't sleep much. In the morning, she drove back to the Pierce farm, which was not in her plan and which she hadn't called ahead about, and she sat in the Audi at the end of the driveway for a moment before getting out. The door opened before she reached the porch steps. Standing in the doorway was a child. Small, 6 years old, with big ears and dark hair that was doing something independent from whatever it had been asked to do this morning, and very large brown eyes that looked at Vanessa with the flat, uncomplicated assessment that only small children and cats could pull off without being rude. "You're the landlady," Oliver Pierce said. "I am," she said. "Is your dad home?" "He's in the barn. He said if you came back I should tell you to wait inside." He held the door open with the gravity of someone performing an important task. "He said you'd probably come back." She stepped inside. "Did he?" "Yep." Oliver let the door fall shut behind them. "He said you seemed like someone who doesn't let stuff go." He said it without evaluation, just delivery, which somehow made it worse. She sat at the kitchen table and Oliver sat across from her and regarded her with his enormous brown eyes and ate a bowl of cereal methodically while she waited. "Are you going to make us move?" he asked, without looking up from his cereal. "No," she said, before she'd thought about it. Oliver looked up at her. "I don't know what's going to happen with the property," she said, because she wasn't going to lie to a 6-year-old. "But I'm not here to make you move." He seemed to process this. "My dad says the land has memory," he said. "He says my mom is part of it now, because her ashes are in the apple orchard." He said it matter-of-factly, and she felt something pull in her chest. "So we can't leave." Vanessa didn't say anything. "Her name was Clara," Oliver said, still matter-of-fact. "She had brown eyes like me. My dad says I got the best parts of her." The back door opened and Landon came in, ducking slightly under the frame, pulling off a work glove. He looked at Vanessa and then at his son, and something passed across his face. Not alarm, more like a parent's specific attentiveness when they walk into a conversation they don't have context for. "She said she's not making us move," Oliver reported. Landon looked at her. "I meant it," she said. He studied her for a moment. That same careful, unhurried assessment she was starting to recognize as simply how he looked at things. Then he said, "Let me wash up," and went to the sink. Oliver carried his cereal bowl to the counter, rinsed it out with the efficiency of a child who'd been doing chores long enough to have opinions about them, and disappeared into the other room with the loose-limbed confidence of someone going to do something important. Landon dried his hands and sat down across from her. "I called Richard Gaines last night," she said, "the CFO. I asked about the missing submissions and the recharge boundary discrepancies." Landon didn't move, just watched her. "He told me not to get in the weeds on environmental logistics." She met his eyes. "And he said the file was complete." Silence. "He knows," Landon said. Not a question. "I think so." She picked up her coffee cup and put it down without drinking from it. "I need to know what I'm looking at, Landon, not what Meridian documented, not what my company's internal review cleared. What is actually in this valley?" He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Let me show you." Well, they spent the day on the property. He took her to the 3 main well sites on the farm first, showing her the monitoring equipment he'd installed himself. Basic groundwater pressure gauges connected to a data logger he'd built out of parts ordered from an agricultural supply catalog, because the commercial units were too expensive. He showed her his handwritten logs in a composition notebook, 3 years of measurements, dated and noted with the weather conditions at time of reading. "You did all this yourself?" she asked. "Oliver helps with the readings now," he said. "He likes numbers." A pause. "Clara was better at it than either of us." She let that sit without filling it. He took her to the eastern edge of the property, where a natural spring emerged from the base of a limestone formation and crouched beside it, and showed her how the water ran clear in a way that indicated the aquifer below was healthy and undisturbed. "This spring has been running continuously since my grandfather's time," he said. "If the recharge zone is disrupted, if the soil structure above it is broken up by construction, or if excavation cuts through the underlying clay layer, this spring stops." He looked at her. "And when this spring stops, the pressure that keeps the water table stable across the valley drops." He pointed south. "The Atchison's well goes dry first, then the Nguyen's, then the Wellers. By the following summer, you've got 20-plus wells failing across a 30-square-mile area. And no municipal backup," she said. "Nearest city water line is 40 miles east." He stood up. "This isn't a story about being sentimental about land, Ms. Holloway. This is about water. People live here. They drink from these wells. Their kids drink from these wells." She looked at the spring. The water caught the afternoon light and turned it silver. "I know," she said. They ate lunch at a picnic table behind the barn. Sandwiches Oliver had made himself, which had too much mustard and not enough cheese, and were excellent for reasons she couldn't entirely account for. And Oliver asked her questions about Chicago that were specific in a way that suggested he'd been doing research. What was the name of the river that went through the middle of it? How many bridges were there? Was the pizza really as different as people said? "Different from what?" she asked. He considered this seriously. "From normal pizza." "Depends which pizza you think is normal." He seemed to find this a satisfying answer. He nodded and took a large bite of his sandwich. Landon watched his son, and there was something in his face that was so quiet and so full that she looked away. After lunch, when Oliver went inside for what Landon called afternoon book time, in a tone that suggested it was non-negotiable, they sat at the table in the sudden quiet. "Why did you leave environmental law?" she asked. He was quiet for a while, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because I spent 7 years fighting for things, and sometimes winning and sometimes not," he said. "And the whole time I had this place in the back of my mind that needed someone." He looked at the fields. "And then Clara was gone, and Oliver was 4 years old, and it became very clear that the thing that needed someone was him, so I came home." He paused. "The work is still here, as it turns out. Just different. Do you miss it?" "Parts of it." He picked up his coffee. "The courtroom, sometimes. The research, yes. The feeling when you put the evidence together and it's airtight." He glanced at her. "The plane trips and the suits? No." She almost laughed. "What about you?" he asked. "How many of these deals have you closed?" 47. He looked at her. "And what were they building?" She thought about it. A hotel in Montana, a mixed-use development in coastal Georgia, a distribution center in Ohio, a tech campus outside Denver. "Different things," she said. "What happened to the land?" She opened her mouth and closed it. The honest answer was that she didn't know. She'd closed the deal and moved to the next file. He watched her work through that. He didn't say anything about it. 47 deals, she said, and this is the first one where I've had lunch at the property. He considered that. Is it better or worse? She looked at the fields, at the spring she could just see glinting at the tree line, at the barn and the house with the repainted too many times walls, and the drawing on the refrigerator she was still thinking about. Worse for business, she said. Better for most other things. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and finished it and said, "Come on, I want to show you the north end before the light goes." She followed him, and the afternoon settled around the valley like it had been doing it for 100 years, and for a while there was just the sound of grass under their feet and the specific silence of a place that hadn't changed its mind about what it was. She was almost to Harwick when her phone rang. Marcus. "I got what you asked for," he said, and his voice had a quality she didn't recognize at first, something careful, the voice of someone who'd found something they weren't sure they wanted to have found. The submission logs for Creston Valley. There were 2 external submissions flagged in the system. "I know about those. Were they in my file?" "No." A pause. "Vanessa, they're logged as received and then marked as reviewed and incorporated, but they weren't in your file, and I can't find any record of them being reviewed by anyone internally." Another pause, longer. "And the Meridian reports, the 3 most recent ones, Creston Valley included, they were commissioned directly by Richard Gaines' office, not through the standard vendor process." She drove. "That's unusual," she said. "Yeah." Marcus sounded like he was choosing his next words from a very short list of safe options. "There's also something else. The version of the Meridian report in our project file, the one you were given, is dated differently than the version on Meridian's own server, which our IT team can see from the vendor portal. 3 pages are different, including the conclusion section and the recharge boundary map." The road stretched ahead of her, empty and straight. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I need you to download both versions and save them somewhere that isn't our company server. Personal cloud, your personal email, both." A very long pause. "Vanessa, I know what I'm asking." "Do you?" Yes, she said. I'll explain everything when I'm back in Chicago, but I need those files backed up tonight. He exhaled. Okay, he said, in the voice of someone climbing into something without being entirely sure there's a way out the other side. Okay. She hung up and drove the last 6 miles to Harwick with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind running very fast and very quiet at the same time. She thought about Richard Gaines saying that's not your expertise with an edge she'd never heard from him in 6 years. She thought about 2 versions of a document on 2 different servers. She thought about 3 pages, a conclusion section, a recharge boundary map. She thought about the spring at the tree line, catching light, running clear. She pulled into the motel parking lot and sat there with the engine off. 47 deals. She'd been proud of that number. She'd led with it in meetings, held it like a credential, let it do the work of answering questions before they were asked. 47. Never once walked away empty-handed. She thought about what Landon had asked her. What happened to the land? She didn't know. She genuinely didn't know, and she hadn't thought to ask. And that said something she was only now, at the edge of a dark parking lot in a small Tennessee town, beginning to understand. She got out of the car. She had 1 bar of service, and she used it to find the number for Dr. Anita Chandra at Vanderbilt University's Environmental Science Department. She left a message. She said her name, said she was with Holloway Mead Corporation, and then she stopped and changed that, said she was a private citizen with questions about the Creston Valley hydrogeological study. Said it was important, said she'd appreciate a call back. She went inside and sat on the edge of the motel bed in her work clothes. For the first time in 9 years, she had absolutely no idea what she was going to do next. And somehow, unexpectedly, inexplicably, that didn't feel like failure. It felt like the first honest thing that had happened to her in a very long time. Dr. Anita Chandra called back at 7:14 in the morning, which told Vanessa 2 things. The woman was an early riser, and she'd been waiting for this call. "Miss Holloway," she said, and her voice was precise and a little clipped in the way of someone who chose words carefully because she'd learned the cost of imprecision. "You said private citizen, but you work for Holloway Mead." "I said I was with Holloway Mead," Vanessa said. Past tense felt premature at the time. She was sitting at the small desk in her motel room with a cup of bad coffee and her laptop open. "I'm calling about your 2019 study on the Creston Valley Aquifer Recharge System." A pause. "I know why you're calling. Then you know more than I do." "I submitted that study to your company 8 months ago," Dr. Chandra said, "attached to a formal objection letter co-signed by 3 other researchers. We never received a substantive response. We received a form letter." The flatness in her voice was the flatness of someone who'd stopped being surprised and moved into something colder. "And then 2 weeks ago, I was contacted by a man named Gerald Pruitt, who I later confirmed is a senior associate at Meridian Environmental Partners, asking me to clarify certain methodology questions about my study." "What kind of questions?" "The kind designed to establish doubt about my methodology without engaging with the data." Dr. Chandra's voice was dry as chalk. "It's a technique. You ask whether the researcher considered variable X, even when the study addresses variable X clearly in Section 4. You ask whether the sample size was sufficient, knowing the answer is yes. You manufacture ambiguity for later use in legal proceedings." A pause. "I've seen it before. I told Mr. Pruitt I had nothing to clarify." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "Dr. Chandra, if I told you there appear to be 2 versions of the Meridian Environmental Assessment for Creston Valley, one submitted to regulators and one in my company's internal file, with different recharge boundary maps, what would that tell you?" The pause on the other end was long enough that Vanessa thought the line might have dropped. "It would tell me," Dr. Chandra said carefully, "that what I suspected was document manipulation rather than simple negligence." Another pause. "It would also tell me that whoever you are, and whatever your relationship to Holloway Mead actually is right now, you should be very careful." "I'm aware." "Are you? Because the people who alter environmental documents in land development cases don't do it casually. They do it because the financial stakes are large enough that the risk calculus works in their favor." Her voice was precise and unhesitating. I've testified in 4 cases like this. 2 of them ended with criminal charges. One of them, the researcher who first raised the alarm, had her car broken into and her hard drive taken 3 weeks before the hearing. The bad coffee went cold in Vanessa's hand. I'm going to send you everything I have, Dr. Chandra said. The full data set, the field measurements, the peer review correspondence, all of it. I've been waiting for someone inside that company to call. A beat. Don't wait too long before deciding which side of this you're on. These things have a way of accelerating. She hung up, and Vanessa sat in the early morning light of a motel room in Harwick, Tennessee, and thought about hard drives and car break-ins and the sound of Richard Gaines' voice saying close the deal with that new edge in it. And she understood, in the specific way that only happens when you can't ununderstand something, that she was already past the point of easy exits. She drove to the farm without calling ahead, which she was starting to recognize as becoming a habit. Landon was at the kitchen table when she knocked. She could see him through the window, reading something, a mug at his elbow. And he looked up and opened the door without particular surprise. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. "I got 4 hours." She came inside. "I talked to Dr. Chandra this morning." He went still. "Anita Chandra. She sent me her full data set, and she told me about the Meridian associate who contacted her 2 weeks ago trying to establish methodology doubt." She sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which she noticed, and which Landon didn't seem to mind. "Landon, my assistant found 2 versions of the Meridian report, different recharge boundary maps, different conclusion sections." He sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him. Not the flicker of indication she might have expected from someone who'd been saying for months that something was wrong, but something more complicated. Something that looked like the specific tiredness of a person who'd known a hard thing was coming and is now watching it arrive. "How different?" he said. "The boundary in your file, Dr. Chandra's map, puts the recharge zone 900 meters further north than what Meridian documented. In the internal version my company has, the version that was used to get regulatory clearance, the boundary stops just outside the development footprint." She spread her hands. "Conveniently," he exhaled slowly through his nose. "They moved the line." "Yes." "On the map that went to the state environmental office." "Yes." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. From somewhere upstairs came the sound of Oliver moving around, the particular thump and drag of a small person getting dressed. "When I was practicing," Landon said, still looking at the ceiling, "I worked a case in Louisiana. Chemical company had altered soil contamination reports for 2 years before anyone caught it. By the time the case went to trial, 6 families had been drinking tainted water for almost 3 years." He brought his gaze back down. The company's defense was that the alterations were the work of a single rogue employee and that senior management had no knowledge. He looked at her evenly. That defense worked. "It's not going to work here," she said. "You don't know that yet. I know that I have both versions of the document, and I have Dr. Chandra's data, and I have the certified mail receipts showing 2 submissions your people sent that were never disclosed to me." She met his eyes. "That's not a rogue employee. That's a pattern." He looked at her for a long moment. She'd noticed before that he looked at things, really looked, without the social reflex of glancing away, and she'd stopped finding it unsettling. "Why are you here?" he said. "And I don't mean that as an accusation. I mean, you could have flown back to Chicago. You could have flagged it internally and let it work through channels and kept your hands clean." "Internal channels are where the submissions went to die," she said. "That's not an answer." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the morning was doing what mornings did in the valley. The light coming in at an angle through the trees, the fields going gold-green, a pair of crows crossing the sky above the barn. Things that had nothing to do with her. "I spent 9 years being very good at not asking what happened to the land," she said. "That's not something I'm proud of." She picked up her coffee cup, which she hadn't poured yet, and was therefore empty, and set it back down. "And there's a child upstairs who told me his mother's ashes are in the apple orchard, and that he can't leave." "So?" Landon said nothing. "So," she said again, quietly. He got up and poured her coffee without being asked. Oliver came downstairs at 8:15 in his school clothes, which he'd clearly assembled with personal conviction rather than external input. The boots were his father's rubber barn boots, too large by several sizes. The shirt had a brontosaurus on it. He had somehow achieved a part in his hair that ran almost perfectly straight down the center, which Vanessa suspected had taken significant effort. "You're here again," he said, not accusingly. "I am," she said. He poured himself a glass of orange juice and sat at the table and looked at her with those large, steady eyes. "Are you going to eat breakfast?" "I haven't decided." "We have eggs." He said this as though it resolved the question. "Oliver," Landon said, "let her drink her coffee." "I'm just saying we have eggs." Oliver drank his juice with the focused efficiency of someone on a schedule. "Dad makes them with cheese. The good kind, not the plastic kind." "The plastic kind," Landon said to Vanessa, in the flat voice of a man who'd had this debate more than once, "is American cheese, which is a legitimate cheese." "It's plastic," Oliver said, with the serenity of someone who knew they were right. Vanessa laughed. It came out before she could modulate it, a real laugh, a little rough at the edges from the bad sleep and the bad coffee, and the weight of everything that had been sitting on her chest since yesterday. Landon looked at her with something surprised and quiet in his expression. Oliver looked at her with satisfaction, as if this was exactly the response he'd intended. Landon made eggs with the good cheese, and they ate, and it was the most normal thing Vanessa had done in longer than she could accurately track. After Oliver left for school on the bus, he ran the last 50 feet to catch it with his father's boots clomping comically, made the step with one hand on the rail, turned back and waved at them without apparent embarrassment. Landon and Vanessa spread everything out on the kitchen table. 2 versions of the Meridian report, printed side by side. Dr. Chandra's full data set. Landon's 3 years of groundwater monitoring logs, the certified mail receipts, and a legal pad, on which Landon began writing in a hand she had to lean forward to read. Small, dense, organized. "The way I see it," he said, "you have 2 kinds of problems, the evidentiary problem and the procedural problem." "Walk me through it." He tapped the 2 Meridian reports. "The evidentiary problem is the falsification itself. 2 versions of a document submitted to state regulators with different scientific findings. That's potentially a criminal matter. Falsifying documents submitted to a regulatory body in Tennessee is a Class D felony, and if the same practice has happened in other states, you're looking at federal exposure depending on which programs funded the regulatory review. Holloway Meade has received federal infrastructure grants on 3 projects in the last 2 years, Vanessa said. He looked at her. "Which projects?" "Ohio, Colorado, the coastal Georgia one." She paused. "Meridian did the environmental assessments on all 3. Landon wrote something on the legal pad. "Okay, that matters. Federal funding, federal jurisdiction, different set of teeth." He moved to the second pile. "The procedural problem is the buried submissions. Your company received scientific counter-evidence from Dr. Chandra's group and from my direct correspondence, and that evidence was not disclosed in the regulatory process and wasn't provided to you as the acquisitions lead." He looked up. "Who had authority to make that call? Who could have pulled those submissions out of the disclosure process?" She'd been thinking about this since the night before. The project file was managed through the CFO's office. "Richard Gaines." She paused. "He's been with the company 12 years. He has a relationship with Meridian that predates the current projects." "Personal relationship or professional?" "Both, I think. They went to the same business school. I don't know more than that." Landon wrote it down. "We need to know more than that." "I'm not a private investigator." "No," he said. "But you have access to company records that I don't. Vendor contracts, payment histories, communication logs." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. I'm asking you whether, in the normal course of your work, you have access to information that would establish the nature of the relationship between Gaines and Meridian." She thought about it. She had access to the project management system. She had access to the vendor portal. As acquisitions director, she had standing to review project documentation, including financial records tied to the acquisitions she was managing. "Carefully," she said, "and only what I can access through my normal credentials. That's all I'm asking." They worked for 2 hours. She accessed Holloway Mead's vendor portal on her laptop and pulled the payment records for Meridian's work on the Creston Valley project. Standard enough, a project fee paid in 2 installments. Then she cross-referenced with the Ohio and Colorado projects. Meridian's fees on those assessments were normal. But on Creston Valley, there was a second line item, coded to a consulting category she didn't recognize. Strategic Analysis Services. $15,000, paid 60 days after the environmental assessment was submitted. What's Strategic Analysis Services? Landon asked. Not a service category that exists in our standard vendor framework, she said. I've never seen it. Meaning it was added custom. Meaning someone added it to the system for this specific payment. She looked at the screen. Which means someone with admin access to the financial system processed a non-standard payment to Meridian after the assessment was submitted. Gaines has admin access to the financial system. So do 4 other people, she said. But yes. Landon leaned back and looked at the ceiling again, in the way she was learning meant he was organizing something. It's not enough by itself, he said. A non-standard payment could be explained as a supplemental consulting fee. Combined with the 2-version document and the buried submissions, it starts to tell a story. But a good defense attorney takes these things apart individually. He brought his gaze back down. We need the original field data from Meridian's assessment, not their report. Their raw field data. Whatever measurements they actually took before they wrote the report. How would I get that? You wouldn't, not through your credentials. He paused. But Dr. Chandra might know someone at Meridian who has doubts. Consulting firms doing this kind of work, there are usually people inside who know what happened and aren't comfortable with it. They just need a path. Vanessa looked at him. You've done this before. Not this exactly. He picked up his coffee. But building a case, yes. You don't go into court with assumptions. You go in with documentation, and the documentation either holds up or it doesn't. He paused. The documentation we have right now is compelling but attackable. We need something that isn't. She sat with that. Through the window, she could see the south field where she'd stood with him yesterday. The long, natural basin. The tree line where the spring caught light. She thought about 36 wells. She thought about what dry wells meant in a place without municipal water connections. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. The legal work, God, you were good at it. You said you missed the research, the courtroom. She looked at him. Why didn't you go back after Clara died? Oliver's in school now. You could practice remotely for some of it. He was quiet for a moment, not defensive, just processing the question. I tried, he said. About a year after I came home. I took on a small case, water rights dispute in the next county. Thought I'd ease back in. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. First day I drove to the courthouse. I got there and sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes, and then drove home. A pause. Oliver was waiting on the porch. He didn't ask where I'd been. He just said, I saved you the last piece of cornbread, and went back inside. She didn't say anything. It wasn't the right time, he said. Maybe I was afraid that if I rebuilt that part of my life, I'd be building something that wasn't connected to her anymore. He set the cup down. Claire used to say I took in broken things and fixed them without asking if they wanted to be fixed. A small, complicated smile. She was usually right. Vanessa looked at him. She noticed the small things, the way he kept his voice steady when he talked about Clara, the specific steadiness of a person who'd done grief work and hadn't finished it, and knew he hadn't finished it. The way he checked the window every so often in the unconscious direction of wherever Oliver had gone. The legal pad with its dense, organized handwriting, the handwriting of someone whose mind still worked the way it had always worked, whatever he told himself about parking lots. The case is here now, she said. He met her eyes. You don't have to drive to a courthouse, she said. It came to you. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully name. Not quite gratitude, not quite reluctance. Something between them, unresolved, that he pressed down in a way with the practiced efficiency of a person who'd learned to keep the interior organized. Let's call Dr. Chandra, he said. They put the call on speakerphone at the kitchen table. Dr. Chandra listened without interrupting while Landon laid out what they had. The 2 document versions, the non-standard payment, the buried submissions, and when he finished, there was a pause of several seconds. "Gerald Pruitt," she said. "The Meridian associate who called me. He's been there 4 years. He does field work, not report writing." Another pause. "When he called me about methodology, he was asking questions that suggested he'd read my study very carefully, more carefully than someone trying to discredit it." A beat. "I think he read it because he was troubled by the discrepancy between what his field data showed and what the final report said." Vanessa leaned toward the phone. "You think he knows?" "I think he took the measurements that didn't match what ended up in the document, and I think that's been sitting with him." Dr. Chandra's voice was measured and precise. "I'm not going to contact him. That has to come from someone who can offer him something I can't." "What can I offer him?" Vanessa said. "Evidence that he's not alone in this," Landon said before Dr. Chandra could answer. He was looking at the table. "That's what whistleblowers need, not protection. They need to know that there's already enough that they're coming forward complete something rather than starts it from zero." He looked up at Vanessa. "He needs to know the picture is already mostly there, and he's the last piece." She thought about that. She thought about being the person who made that call to a stranger at a company that was connected to the company that employed her, about documents that potentially implicated her company's CFO in something that was going to end careers and possibly freedom. She thought about 47 deals and a question she'd never thought to ask. "I'll call him," she said. She stepped outside to make the call. Standing on the porch with the afternoon sun on her face and the sound of Landon cleaning up inside and a hawk circling somewhere over the south field. Gerald Pruitt answered on the second ring. He sounded young, maybe late 20s, and when she said her name and her company, his voice went flat in the specific way of someone who's been anticipating a call they'd hoped wouldn't come. "I'm not calling to threaten you," she said immediately. "I'm calling because I think you took field measurements last year that don't match what ended up in the final report, and I need you to tell me whether I'm right." Silence. "Ms. Holloway, my company is about to break ground on a project that will destroy the water supply for 36 families," she said. "I have 2 versions of your firm's report, and I have independent scientific data that contradicts both of them, and I have a non-standard payment from my CFO to your firm that I can't explain." She paused. "I'm not building a case against you. I'm building a case, and you're going to have to decide whether you're in it or not." A very long silence. "The recharge zone," Gerald Pruitt said finally. His voice was careful and quiet. "In the field, the indicators went a lot further north than what ended up in the final document. I flagged it in my field notes. My supervisor told me the client had provided additional geological context that explained the discrepancy." Another pause. "I asked to see that geological context. I never received it." Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. "Would you be willing to provide your original field notes?" The silence this time was the longest yet. "I have kids," he said. Not as an excuse, as a fact, the way Landon had said Oliver that first day, like a weight that was also the only thing keeping you level. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry this landed on you." Another long pause. Then, "I kept copies, personal files not on the company server." A breath. "Give me 48 hours." She said she would. She thanked him. She stood on the porch until she heard the click of the line going dead, and then she stood there a little longer with the hawk still circling and the valley doing what it did, turning slow and golden in the afternoon. When she went back inside, Landon was at the table. He looked at her face. "He's going to help," she said. He nodded slowly, and something shifted in his posture. Not relief exactly, more like the specific adjustment of a person who has been holding tension in a particular direction for a very long time and now feels it shift towards something with a shape. "Then we have a case," he said. "We have the beginning of one." She sat down. "Landon, if this goes the way I think it's going to go—" She stopped. She looked at the table. "I won't have a job on the other side of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that," she said. "I'm not looking for reassurance. I wanted to say it out loud to someone who was going to hear it without trying to talk me out of it." He looked at her with those steady eyes. "You already decided," he said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, she said. I think I decided in the parking lot of a diner in Harwick over bad lemon meringue pie. She almost smiled. Possibly earlier. He nodded again and didn't say anything more about it, and she found that she was grateful for that in a way that was hard to account for. The way some people's silence was its own kind of answer. Outside, the afternoon was going toward evening, the light changing the way it did over the valley, long and amber and patient. The spring at the tree line was invisible from here, but she knew it was there, running clear, the way it had been running since before either of them were born. She reached out and pulled the legal pad toward her. She turned to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, "What we have, what we need, what comes next." Landon leaned over and looked at the page. Then he picked up his pen. Gerald Pruitt's files arrived 43 hours later, not 48. Vanessa took that as a sign of either urgency or anxiety, and given the content of what he sent, both seemed reasonable. She was at the farm when the email came through. She'd been spending most of her days there now, a fact she hadn't examined too closely. Landon's kitchen table had become their working space by default, partly because the farm had the documentation, and partly because the motel room in Harwick was genuinely depressing in a way that made sustained concentration difficult. She told herself those were the reasons. She mostly believed them. Pruitt had sent 3 attachments. The first was a PDF of his original field notes, handwritten on Meridian Standard Site assessment forms, dated 14 months ago. The second was a series of GPS-tagged photographs taken at the measurement sites, with coordinates and timestamps. The third was a single-page typed memo, addressed to his direct supervisor at Meridian, flagging the discrepancy between his field findings and a preliminary draft of the report he'd been shown, and asking, formally, for an explanation. There was no response attached to the memo, because no response had ever been given. Landon read through the field notes while Vanessa worked through the photographs on her laptop, cross-referencing the GPS coordinates against Dr. Chandra's map. When she finished, she sat back and said, "Every single measurement site is consistent with Chandra's recharge boundary. Not close, exactly consistent. He was standing in the same place as she stood and reading the same data." Landon set the field notes down. And the final Meridian report moved the boundary 900 meters south of every one of those measurement sites. Yes. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way that meant he was building something in his mind, organizing the structure of it. Then he said, "They didn't just adjust the data. They created a new map from scratch and retroactively attached it to fabricated measurement coordinates. That's not a rounding error. That's not professional disagreement between experts." He looked at her. "That's document fraud." The word landed in the quiet kitchen the way words sometimes do, not dramatically, but with the particular weight of something that can't be taken back. "I know," Vanessa said, "and your CFO's fingerprints are on the payment that followed." "I know that too." He picked up his coffee and didn't drink it. "This is going to get ugly before it gets resolved." "It's already ugly," she said. "I just didn't know it was ugly until last week." She looked at the table, at the organized piles of documentation they'd built up over the last 3 days. "I need to call my attorney, personal attorney, not company counsel." She paused. "Do you have someone? Someone who handles this kind of case?" He looked at her with a slight tired smile. "I am someone who handles this kind of case." "You're not licensed anymore." "My Tennessee bar status is inactive, not revoked. I can apply for reinstatement." He set the cup down. "It takes time, though. Weeks, minimum." "We may not have weeks." He nodded. He already knew that. "I know a federal environmental attorney in Nashville, Ellen Marsh. She's handled 3 major regulatory fraud cases in the last decade. 2 of them ended in criminal referrals." He paused. "She's not cheap." "I'm not asking you to pay for her." Vanessa met his eyes. "This started as my company's project. Whatever it costs to clean it up, I'm carrying that." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She said it without sharpness, but without softness either, just the flat directness she used when something was decided. "I'm not doing it out of guilt. I'm doing it because it's right and I can. And those 2 things don't always line up, but when they do, you don't argue about it." A pause. Something moved through his expression that she'd started to recognize, that moment when the door opened another inch. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll call Ellen." Ellen Marsh drove up from Nashville the following morning in a gray Subaru with a dented rear quarter panel and a back seat full of file boxes, which Vanessa found immediately reassuring. She was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead and the direct, slightly impatient energy of someone who had run out of time for preamble about 20 years ago. She sat at the kitchen table, put on her glasses, and read through everything without speaking for 45 minutes. Vanessa and Landon sat across from her and drank coffee and didn't try to narrate. Oliver came downstairs at some point, assessed the situation, made himself a bowl of cereal, and went back upstairs without being asked, which Vanessa was starting to understand was simply how he operated in the presence of adult seriousness. Ellen pulled off her glasses and set them on the table. "All right," she said. "The good news is that you have significantly more than I expected walking in the door. 2 document versions. Field notes from an inside source, GPS-tagged photographs, a formal memo that proves the discrepancy was flagged internally and then buried, and an anomalous financial transaction in the acquisition file." She looked at them both. "The bad news is that what you have is enough to start a fire, but not enough to control where it burns." "What do we need?" Landon asked. "Chain of custody on the document manipulation," she said. "Right now you can prove 2 versions exist. You can't yet prove who created the second version, or when. You need metadata from the original files, creation timestamps, author fields, edit histories." She looked at Vanessa. "Can you access the source files on your company's server?" "My credentials are still active," she said carefully. For the moment is all we need." Ellen leaned forward. "I want you to understand what I'm about to say very clearly. You access only what you have legitimate standing to access under your current role. You do not go anywhere your credentials don't normally take you. You download nothing that isn't already in the project file you're managing." She looked at Vanessa without blinking. "You are the acquisitions director on this project. The project file is yours to review. The documents in that file, including the Meridian assessment, are documents you have professional standing to examine. And if examining them turns up metadata that incriminates someone, then that's what examining them turned up." Ellen's voice was entirely flat. "You are not doing anything wrong. You are doing your job. Are we clear?" "Clear," Vanessa said. "Good." Ellen picked up her pen. "Now, the other piece I need is a record of the communications between Gaines and Meridian, not the payment records, the actual communications. Emails, meeting notes, anything that shows coordination between your CFO and the firm that falsified the document." She paused. "That's harder to get legitimately, which means we may have to get it through discovery once we file." "File where?" Landon asked. "Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation first. They're the regulatory body that cleared the development based on the falsified assessment. We file a formal complaint with attached evidence, trigger an investigation, and use the investigation to compel document production from Holloway Mead." She tapped her pen on the table. "Simultaneously, if the federal funding connection holds up, Ohio, Colorado, Georgia, we notify the EPA's Office of Inspector General. Federal agencies do not like finding out their grant money went to projects approved on fraudulent environmental documentation." Landon had the legal pad out and was writing. "Timeline? Filing the state complaint, given what you have, 2 weeks. Maybe 10 days if Vanessa gets the metadata today, and it's what we expect." Ellen looked at him. "The state investigation could take months, but the filing itself is public record and triggers an automatic hold on development activity pending review." "The groundbreaking is in 6 weeks, Vanessa said. "Then we file in 10 days. Ellen looked at her. "Can you get the metadata today?" "Yes," she said. She drove back to the motel and opened her laptop and logged into the Holloway Mead project management system, which she'd been accessing all week without issue. She pulled up the Creston Valley project file. The Meridian assessment was there, labeled and dated. She opened the document properties. The file had been created by a user with the ID rjanes_admin. The creation date was 8 months ago, consistent with when the assessment was submitted. But the last modified date was 6 months ago, 2 months after the document had already been submitted to the state regulatory office. Someone had modified the submitted document after submission. She sat very still for a moment. She screenshot the properties window, then opened the file itself and pulled up the full edit history. Most of it was administrative notations, page formatting, a header update. But on one date, 6 months ago, 3 pages had been substantially rewritten. The pages that covered the recharge zone analysis and the boundary map. The user who'd made those edits, rgains_admin. She downloaded the file, emailed it to Ellen Marsh's personal account, and then, because she knew what was coming next, had known since she left the farm, had known maybe since the parking lot of the diner, she opened a blank document and started typing. She was still typing when her phone rang. Richard Gaines. She looked at the name on the screen for 2 rings. Then she answered. Richard. Vanessa. His voice had the particular smoothness of someone who had decided on a tone in advance. I've been getting some unusual system activity flags from IT. Looks like there's been some extensive access to the Creston Valley project file from your credentials in the last few days. I've been reviewing the project documentation, she said, which is my job. Of course. The smoothness didn't waver. I just wanted to check in. See how things were going down there. Pierce hasn't signed, obviously. No, she said, and we're running up against the timeline. I'm going to need you to come back to Chicago. We can regroup, look at alternative approaches, possibly consider eminent domain options through our legal team. Richard. She kept her voice level. I've seen both versions of the Meridian report. Silence. Not the pause of someone processing unexpected information. The silence of someone who has just heard exactly what they were afraid of hearing. I don't know what you think you've found, he said, and the smoothness was still there, but something had gone out of it, the way a light looks when the power flickers. I think I've found that the document submitted to the Tennessee DECA is materially different from the field data collected by Meridian's own survey team, and I think I've found that the source file was modified 6 months ago, after submission, by a user with your admin credentials. She paused. And I think Gerald Pruitt's original field notes and GPS-tagged photographs are currently in the possession of an environmental attorney in Nashville. Another silence. Longer. You need to be very careful, he said. His voice was different now. The smoothness was gone entirely. You are an employee of this company. Everything you've accessed on that system, everything you've done in the last week, you're exposed here too. You signed documents for this project. Your name is on correspondence. My name was on correspondence, she said. I'd like to know what else my name is on. The silence that followed this was the longest yet. What do you mean? He said carefully. The legal filings for the regulatory application, the ones that went to the state office with the Meridian assessment attached. She kept her voice very steady. I've been thinking about this. Whose signature is on the cover letter for that submission? Your signature is on standard, Richard. She stopped him. Is it my actual signature or is it my name? The silence on the other end of the line became something different. Became the silence of a man standing at the edge of something and looking down. You forged my signature, she said. Not a question. He didn't answer. Richard, did you forge my signature on the regulatory submission? The document was submitted under standard authorization procedure. That's not an answer. He exhaled, just once, short and controlled, and in that exhale she heard the whole thing, the calculation, the decision, the specific moral arithmetic of a man who had told himself for long enough that the end justified the means that he'd stopped being able to see the means clearly. You should come back to Chicago, he said. We should talk about this in person, with legal present, and figure out the right path forward. The right path forward, she said, is the one I'm already on. She hung up. She sat there for a moment with her heart going faster than she wanted it to, and her hands completely steady, which surprised her. She had expected her hands to shake. They didn't. She picked up the phone and called Landon. He answered on the second ring. He forged my signature, she said, on the regulatory submission. He put my name on the cover letter that went to the state office with the falsified report. A pause. Are you sure? He didn't deny it. Another pause. Vanessa. His voice was careful and direct in the way she'd come to rely on. Listen to me. Call Ellen right now. Tell her everything that just happened, word for word, while you remember it exactly. I know. And then he stopped. And then, she said. Come back here, he said. Don't stay in that motel alone tonight. She almost said I'm fine. She almost said I don't need that. She almost did what she always did, which was take care of herself efficiently and not let the weight of things show. Instead, she said, okay. She told Ellen everything, dictated the conversation verbatim into a voice memo while she drove, and sent Ellen the audio file along with the metadata screenshot and the downloaded document. Ellen called back 20 minutes later. Forging a signature on a regulatory submission is a separate offense from the document fraud, she said, without preamble. It also means they were trying to spread the liability. If the project gets challenged legally, having your signature on the submission implicates you along with them. A pause. It's actually better for us that he did it. Better, Vanessa said. It means they were scared of their own exposure. You don't forge someone else's signature unless you're trying to distribute the risk. Ellen's voice was precise and unemotional in the way of someone who processed these things as puzzles rather than outrages, which Vanessa found useful right now. It also means you're now a victim of the fraud as well as a witness to it. That changes your legal standing significantly. What do I do about my job? Nothing yet. Do not resign. Do not respond to any company communications without running them through me first, and do not access any additional company systems. A pause. And Vanessa, change your passwords. Personal accounts, email, everything. If Gaines has admin access to the company system, he has access to company email. She thought about the emails she'd sent Marcus from her company account. I need to warn Marcus, she said. Do it from your personal phone, personal email. Now. She pulled over on the county road and texted Marcus from her personal number. Don't use company email. Don't access anything on your work computer. Call me from your personal phone when you can. You're not in trouble, but we need to talk. His response came in under a minute. Already figured something was up. Calling you in 5. She sat on the shoulder of the road with the engine running and the afternoon going gold around her. The fields and the fence posts and the particular stillness of a place that didn't know or care about any of what was happening. Marcus called. She told him the shape of it without all the details, enough for him to understand why she'd asked him to back up those files, enough for him to know to be careful. He was 26 and had been her assistant for 3 years, and he listened with the focused quiet of someone who was scared but not panicking, which was exactly right. What do I do? He said when she finished. You're a witness to the fact that the submissions weren't in the project file, she said. That's your piece. You don't have to do anything except be honest if anyone asks you. She paused. And Marcus, if anyone from the company contacts you about what you pulled from the system, you call me immediately. Not HR, not legal. Me. Okay. A breath. Vanessa? Are you okay? She looked out the windshield at the valley. Yeah, she said. I think I actually am. She got to the farm at 5:30. The kitchen light was on, and she could smell something cooking from the porch, which turned out to be pasta, which Landon was making with the particular focused distraction of someone doing a physical task while thinking about something else. Oliver was at the table doing what appeared to be homework, though on closer inspection the notebook was open to a drawing of what Vanessa eventually determined was a very detailed excavator. That's for science, Oliver said, without looking up. Excavators are science? Earth science. He added a very serious caterpillar tread. We're doing how machines change the land. Vanessa sat down across from him. Landon glanced at her from the stove, and she gave a small nod, and he read it correctly and went back to the pasta. What did you find out? Oliver asked, still drawing. She looked at him. About what? About whether the bad guys are actually bad guys. He looked up then with Clara's eyes. Dad says sometimes people do bad things because they're scared of losing things, not because they're bad people. He considered this. But sometimes they're just bad. This one's the second kind, I think, she said. Oliver nodded seriously. Okay. He went back to his excavator. Dad also says the truth is heavy, but it's better than putting it down. Landon set a bowl of pasta on the table and said, "Oliver, I'm just telling her what you said. I know what you're doing." Oliver returned to his drawing with the serenity of someone who has said exactly what they intended to say. Vanessa looked at Landon, and he looked back at her with the tired, complicated expression of a parent whose child has just accurately quoted them in a conversation they weren't quite ready to have. And she felt something loosen in her chest, some tight, wound thing that had been holding since that phone call on the county road. They ate dinner. Oliver told them at length about the geology unit and about how limestone was made of old sea creatures, which was actually kind of disgusting but also really impressive, and about how the Creston Valley had probably been underwater a long time ago. Landon confirmed this and added some specifics about the geological timeline, and Oliver listened with the specific pleasure of a child receiving information they'd asked for from someone they trusted. After dinner, Oliver went upstairs, and they sat at the cleared table with the documents between them, and Landon looked at the metadata screenshot and the edit history and didn't say anything for a long moment. He modified the document 6 months after submission, he said. Yes. Which means the original submission might have been closer to the real data. He may have realized the risk later and gone back to strengthen the case for the boundary line. She hadn't thought of it from that angle. You mean the fraud may have happened in stages? I mean it may have been reactive rather than planned from the start, which matters for intent. He looked at her. In a criminal case, premeditated document fraud is a different charge than after-the-fact alteration driven by panic. Does it matter? For us? For what we're filing? For the criminal case, it matters enormously. For the regulatory filing, he shook his head. No. Fraud is fraud regardless of when it happened. He paused. But understanding the timeline helps us tell the story correctly. Regulators and juries both respond to narrative. If Gaines started with genuine incompetence and tipped into criminal behavior when the project got scrutiny, he stopped. That's still criminal, but it's a different story than a man who planned it from day one. She looked at him. You're already thinking about how to present it. Aren't you? She thought about it. I'm thinking about what comes after we file and the company responds. Because they will respond. They have a legal department with 14 attorneys and a PR firm that costs more per month than my first apartment. They'll try to discredit you first, he said. Make the story about a disgruntled employee stealing proprietary documents. They'll say you went rogue, violated your employment agreement, colluded with a landowner who had financial motive to kill the deal. And you, she said. They'll say you manufactured the dispute to protect your property value. He nodded. He'd clearly already thought about this. I've been through public smear campaigns before. On the other side, mostly. I know how they work. He looked at her steadily. The answer to all of it is documentation. If the paper trail is clean and complete and independently verified, there's nothing to stick. Ellen says we file in 10 days. Then we spend the next 10 days making the paper trail airtight. He pulled the legal pad toward him. I want to go back through everything. Timeline, source, verification status. He picked up his pen. Every piece. She reached over and turned the legal pad slightly so she could read it alongside him. They worked until 11. At some point, Landon made more coffee. At some point, the house got quiet in the way it got when Oliver had been asleep for a while. A different quality of quiet than daytime, fuller and more still. The paper spread across the table between them, the lamp throwing a warm circle over it, the night pressing softly against the windows. At one point, she said, "My mother is going to be furious with me." And Landon looked up and she said, "She worked incredibly hard so I would have a stable career and a nice apartment and not have to worry." And he said, "What will you tell her?" And she said, "The truth eventually. When I can say it without my voice doing something embarrassing." He looked at her for a moment. "She'll understand. Eventually." "Maybe." Vanessa looked at the table. "She always said I was too good at winning the wrong things." A pause. "I thought she was wrong. And now?" She picked up her pen. "And now I think she was right. And I'm not going to tell her that for at least 2 years because she'll be insufferable about it." He almost laughed. The almost was enough. They went back to work and the valley settled into its deep nighttime quiet, and the lamp held its circle, and the case grew incrementally more complete with each page they worked through, the way things do when two people are building something together and have stopped noticing whose idea was whose. At 11, she gathered her copies and stood to leave. Landon walked her to the door, which he hadn't done before, and they stood for a moment on the porch in the cool night air, with the stars doing what they do over open country, spreading out fully without the competition of city light. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The table, the eggs, the—" She stopped because the list was longer than she could finish without it becoming something she hadn't decided to say yet. He looked at her in the dark, and the quiet between them had the specific quality of something that was being recognized by both of them without being named. "Drive safe," he said. "The deer are bad at night on Route 9. "Okay," she said. She drove back to Harwick with the windows down again. The deer were, in fact, bad on Route 9. She had to brake hard twice, and the second time her heart hammered for a full 30 seconds afterward. But she made it back, and she sat in the parking lot of the motel for a moment before going in, and she thought about 10 days, and about what came after 10 days, and about the drawing on the refrigerator, and about the spring at the tree line, and about how it was possible to spend 9 years being very good at something and not once ask the one question that mattered. She went inside. She did not sleep badly. That itself felt like something. The formal complaint was filed on a Thursday morning, 9 days after Ellen Marsh had driven up from Nashville with her dented Subaru and her file boxes, and her 45 minutes of uninterrupted reading. Ellen filed it herself, in person, at the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation's regional office in Knoxville. Vanessa had offered to go. Ellen had told her to stay in Creston Valley, which was the kind of instruction that sounded like consideration, but was actually strategy. Ellen didn't want Vanessa available for impromptu press conversations in a government parking lot, and she said so plainly. The complaint ran to 63 pages with 212 pages of attached exhibits. It named Holloway Mead Corporation and Richard Gaines by name. It documented the two versions of the Meridian Environmental Assessment, the metadata proving post-submission alteration, Gerald Pruitt's field notes, and GPS photographs, Dr. Chandra's independent hydrogeological study, the anomalous financial transaction coded as Strategic Analysis Services, the two suppressed public submissions, and the forged signature on the regulatory cover letter. It requested an immediate investigation, a suspension of all development activity pending review, and referral to the State Attorney General's Office for criminal evaluation. Ellen called Landon at 10:14 that morning to confirm it was filed. He was standing in the equipment shed replacing a belt on the baler when the call came through, and he stood there with the phone pressed to his ear and grease on his hands and said, "Okay," in a voice that didn't have any particular drama in it. Then he set the phone down on the workbench and stood there for a moment, looking at nothing specifically, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter than either. The particular stillness of a thing that has been set in motion and cannot now be stopped. He went back to the belt. Vanessa was in the farmhouse kitchen when he came in an hour later, laptop open, phone on the table beside it. She'd been there most mornings for 2 weeks now, driving over from Harwick at 7:30, which neither of them had formally arranged, and both of them had stopped commenting on. She looked up when he came in and read his face. "Ellen called you," she said. "Yep." "How do you feel?" He went to the sink and worked the grease off his hands. "Ask me again in 3 weeks when I know whether the state is going to take it seriously." "Ellen says they have to." Ellen is very good at her job, and also she's been doing this long enough to know that "have to" is a complicated phrase. He dried his hands and sat down across from her. "How are you doing?" She'd been waiting for a response from her own attorney, a Chicago-based counsel named Patricia Dunn, who handled employment and whistleblower cases, and who had told Vanessa 3 days ago, in the frank tone of someone whose job was to deliver news without padding, that Holloway Mead would almost certainly terminate her employment the moment the complaint became public record, and that the forged signature actually gave Vanessa strong grounds for a wrongful termination claim if she wanted to pursue it. Vanessa had said she'd think about it. "Patricia says I should expect the termination notice sometime today," she said. "Once the filing is on public record, the company's outside counsel will advise them to cut me loose before I can access anything else." Landon looked at her. And I'm okay with it." She said it evenly. I've been okay with it for a while, I think. I just had to catch up to myself. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the morning was clear and cold, the first real cold snap of the season coming through overnight, the fields gone stiff with early frost. Oliver had gone to school in his winter coat for the first time, had spent 6 minutes trying to get the zipper right, and then let Landon do it with the specific surrender of a child who knows when to accept help. There's going to be noise, like Landon said. Once it's public. Press, possibly. Definitely the company's PR people. I know. They're going to say things about you that aren't true. I know that too. She looked at him. I've been preparing for that longer than I've been preparing for anything else about this. A pause. I've been called a lot of things over the years. Difficult, aggressive, too ambitious, not warm enough. She said it without particular bitterness, just inventory. Being called a liar and a thief by a company I just blew the whistle on is going to be unpleasant, but it's not going to be the worst thing anyone said about me. He looked at her with that steady, unhurried attention she'd stopped finding unnerving. Clara would have liked you, he said. It came out simply, without obvious weight, which made it heavier than if he'd tried to make it significant. She didn't say anything for a moment. Tell me about her, she said. It wasn't something she'd asked directly before. She'd gathered pieces, the brown eyes, the ashes in the apple orchard, the way Landon said her name like he was holding it carefully. But she'd never asked outright, and she watched him now decide whether to answer, the small private calculation of someone deciding how much of a wound to let be visible. She argued like a lawyer, even though she was an architect, he said, eventually. She had opinions about everything, and she was right about most of them, which was annoying. He looked at the table. She used to say that I was better at seeing what was wrong with the situation than at seeing what was good about it. She was right about that, too. He paused. She grew up in Savannah. She thought Tennessee winters were personal attacks. A quiet, involuntary, almost smile. Oliver gets the stubbornness from her. The math, too, actually. Vanessa looked at the table. How long did it take to function again? Function. He turned the word over. About 8 months before I could get through a full day without a specific bad hour in it. About a year before I stopped reaching for my phone to tell her things. He paused. I still do that sometimes. Less now, but still. He looked up. You don't stop. You just get better at carrying it. Her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up and read the screen. An email from Holloway Mead's HR director. Subject line. Employment status. Urgent. She set the phone face down without opening it. It can wait, she said. By that afternoon, the story had moved. Ellen had anticipated a lag. Regulatory filings were public record but rarely made news immediately, usually requiring a reporter to be watching the right database. What she hadn't fully anticipated was that someone, almost certainly within the Tennessee environmental community, had tipped off a journalist at the Nashville Banner who covered environmental regulatory cases, and who had, according to Ellen's text, been sitting on pieces of this story for 6 weeks without enough sourcing to publish. The article went up at 2:17 in the afternoon. Vanessa read it on her phone, sitting in Landon's kitchen. The headline was careful and factual. Environmental fraud. Alleged in Creston Valley development deal. Documents show altered reports, forged signatures. The journalist had clearly had time to prepare because the piece was detailed, quoting from the complaint extensively, naming gains, naming meridian, summarizing Dr. Chandra's study. It was careful not to call anything proven that wasn't proven. It mentioned Vanessa by name as the company's former acquisitions director who had filed evidence of the fraud. Former, she noted. The email she hadn't opened had gotten out somehow, or the reporter had called for comment and the company had confirmed her termination. Either way, she texted Ellen. Article is up. Ellen texted back 30 seconds later. I see it. Don't talk to any press. I mean anyone. I don't care if it's your cousin's podcast. Landon was reading the article on his own phone. He set it down and didn't say anything for a moment. They'll respond tonight, he said. The company, press statement. He was right. The Holloway Mead press statement came out at 4:45, and it was, Vanessa thought, about what she'd expected from 14 corporate attorneys working against a deadline. It characterized the complaint as a legally deficient filing based on selectively interpreted internal documents removed without authorization by a terminated employee with a personal grievance. It described the Meridian assessment as rigorously conducted and fully compliant with all applicable regulatory standards. It noted that the company intended to vigorously defend the Creston Valley project and that development would proceed as scheduled pending regulatory review. It did not address the two versions of the document. It did not address the forged signature. It did not address Gerald Pruitt's field notes. "They're hoping the volume of the language drowns the specifics," Landon said. "That's the strategy," Vanessa agreed. "It works about 60% of the time." He looked at her. "What happens to the other 40%? "The other 40% is us," she said. "That's..." The state investigator assigned to the complaint was a woman named Carol Thibodeau, and she called Landon the following Monday morning at 8 sharp, which again told Vanessa something, this time about the speed with which the state was moving, which was faster than Ellen had expected and slightly faster than Carol's own measured tone suggested she typically moved. Carol Thibodeau drove up from Knoxville on Wednesday. She was 60, compact, with short gray hair and a clipboard she carried like a weapon. She walked the property with Landon for 2 hours, took her own water samples from the 3 main well sites, photographed the spring at the tree line, and asked questions that were precise in a way that made clear she had read the complaint in full and understood the science. Vanessa stayed in the farmhouse and made lunch and felt the particular uselessness of not being the one who could help most with a given thing. Oliver came home from school at 3 and found her reorganizing the papers on the kitchen table for the 3rd time and said, "You're nervous," with the direct accuracy of someone who hadn't learned yet to pretend not to notice things. "A little," she said. "My dad gets like that before things that matter," Oliver said, dropping his backpack on a chair. "He reorganizes the shed." "Does it help?" Oliver thought about it. "No, but it makes the shed look better." He looked at her. "Is the water lady going to help us?" "I think so." He nodded. He went to the refrigerator and got an apple and sat at the table and ate it with the focused calm of someone who had been told by a parent, in various ways over various years, that worrying about things you couldn't control was a waste of energy that could go toward things you could. He had absorbed this imperfectly, the way children absorb things from parents, not as a principle but as a practice, which was the more durable form. Carol Thibodeau came back inside at 4:30 and sat at the kitchen table with Landon and Vanessa and her clipboard and said, without preamble, "The physical evidence is consistent with the complaint. The recharge indicators I observed are well north of the boundary documented in the Meridian report." She made a notation. "I'm issuing an immediate suspension of development activity pending full investigation. That goes into effect today, which means if Holloway Mead breaks ground before this is resolved, they're in contempt." Landon's jaw worked once. "Thank you." Carol looked at him over the top of her clipboard. "Don't thank me. The evidence thanked you." She made another notation. "I'm also referring the document alteration and signature forgery findings to the State Attorney General's office for criminal evaluation. That process has its own timeline, and I can't speak to it, but I wanted you to know it's happening." After Carol left, Oliver came back downstairs. He'd gone up to do homework, or the excavator drawing, Vanessa wasn't certain, and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at their faces. "Good news," he said. "Good news," Landon said. Oliver assessed this. "Does that mean we're keeping the farm?" "Yes," Landon said. "Yeah, bud. We're keeping the farm." Oliver processed this for a moment in the serious, internal way he processed most things. Then he said, "Okay," and went back upstairs. And from above them came the sound of him moving around, and then music. He'd gotten a small speaker for his birthday and played it at a volume calibrated to just below what triggered parental intervention. And Vanessa looked at Landon, and he looked at her, and whatever was on both their faces in that moment was something they didn't try to put into words. The state hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, the fastest scheduling Ellen had seen in a regulatory matter of this complexity, which she attributed partly to the public attention the story had gathered. The Nashville Banner article had been picked up by 2 wire services, and there had been a piece in an environmental law journal that Dr. Chandra had shared widely. and partly to the fact that the state regulators understood that a suspended development project cost money every day it sat idle, which created pressure from all sides to resolve the question quickly. The night before the hearing, Landon sat at the kitchen table after Oliver was in bed and looked at his notes and didn't look at them, in the specific way of someone who has prepared as thoroughly as they know how to prepare and has arrived at the place where preparation ends and something else begins. Vanessa was across the table from him. She'd driven over from Harwick at 7, which was 2 hours earlier than her usual arrival, and which neither of them addressed. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I've been ready for this for 2 years," he said. And then, more quietly, "I just didn't know what it was going to look like." She understood that he wasn't talking entirely about the hearing. "It's going to be a room full of people who want it to go away quietly," she said. "The company's counsel is going to be good, and they're going to be aggressive." "I know. They're going to challenge Dr. Chandra's methodology. They're going to argue Pruitt's notes are inadmissible because he didn't have authorization to retain them. They're going to say the metadata could have been misread." "I know all of that." He looked at her. "What are you trying to tell me?" She looked at the table for a moment. "I'm trying to tell you that it's going to get worse before it gets better tomorrow. And I need you to know that I'm not going to flinch." She met his eyes. "Whatever they say about me up there, whatever version of the story they tell about why I did this, I need you to know it's not going to make me change what I say." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know that," he said. "I've known that for a while." She exhaled. "I'm more worried about you," he said. "I'll be fine." "Vanessa." He said her name with the specific weight he sometimes put on it, the weight of someone who had been paying attention. "You're allowed to not be fine. It's the night before you testify against your former employer in a public regulatory hearing. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him. I'm not performing. I genuinely." She stopped. She tried again. "For the first time in 9 years, I know exactly what I'm doing and why I'm doing it and what it's worth. That makes it easier, not easy. Easier." He was quiet. "I thought winning was the thing," she said. "I thought the 47 was the thing." She looked at her hands on the table. "I didn't know what I was winning for." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not romantically, or not only. More the way you put your hand on something real when you want to feel that it's there. She turned her hand over and held on for a moment, and then let go, and they both went back to their notes, and the house was quiet around them with the specific quiet of the night before something that matters. The hearing room in Knoxville was smaller than Vanessa had imagined and more crowded. The State Environmental Board occupied the front panel. 5 members, 2 of whom she recognized from their public records as having backgrounds in environmental science, 3 who were political appointees of varying relevance. Holloway Mead's legal team occupied a long table to the right, 4 attorneys in suits that cost as much as Vanessa's first car, with Richard Gaines seated at the end in the careful stillness of a man who has been told by counsel to show nothing. She hadn't seen Richard since before she'd driven to Tennessee. He looked the same, which surprised her. She'd half expected some visible change, the external evidence of what she now knew about what he'd done. But he just looked like Richard, polished, controlled. The suit still excellent. He didn't look at her. In the gallery, she recognized faces from the valley. The Atchisons. Mrs. One who had driven 40 miles to be here on a weekday morning and was sitting in the 3rd row in her good coat. A dozen other farmers and residents who had received notice of the hearing and understood, in the general outline if not the specific legal detail, what was at stake. Ellen presented the complaint summary first, 22 minutes, methodical and precise, with visual exhibits projected on the screen behind her. Dr. Chandra testified next, handling the cross-examination from Holloway Mead's lead counsel with the flat, unflappable accuracy of a scientist who had spent 2 decades being challenged by people less rigorous than herself. The methodology questions that Meridian's associate had tried to plant doubt about were addressed point by point and dispatched without visible effort. Gerald Pruitt testified by video, which Ellen had arranged, his image slightly pixelated on the hearing room's aging display system, but his voice clear and even. He was 29, it turned out, and looked it. Young enough that the Holloway Mead Council clearly intended to use that to suggest inexperience, tried it in fact with a series of questions about his credentials and his years in field work. Pruitt answered them directly and without defensiveness, and then, when the cross-examination ended, volunteered, because Ellen had prepared him to volunteer it, that he had flagged the discrepancy to his supervisor in writing and received no response, which was not a fact the opposing counsel had wanted in the room. Then Landon testified. He had worn the suit, was the thing, not the work clothes, not the overalls, but an actual suit, dark gray, that fit him the way suits fit men who don't wear them often, slightly off in the shoulders, the collar slightly too careful. He'd told Vanessa the night before that he'd bought it for Claire's funeral and hadn't worn it since, said it plainly, without apparent distress, just information. She had not known what to say to that, so she hadn't said anything, which was, she was learning, sometimes the right answer. He presented the data clearly and without theater. 3 years of groundwater monitoring, the certified mail receipts, the timeline of suppressed submissions. He walked through Dr. Chandra's map against the Meridian report map side by side on the projection screen and explained the discrepancy in language accessible enough that 2 of the board members who had been taking only occasional notes began writing steadily. When Holloway Mead's counsel cross-examined him, they tried the personal motivation angle. You stand to lose significant property value if this project proceeds, isn't that correct? And Landon said yes, and also that 35 other families stood to lose their water supply, and that his field data, compiled independently over 3 years before this dispute began, had been produced solely for the purpose of responsible land stewardship, not litigation, as the dates on the logs clearly showed. The counsel moved on. Then Vanessa took the stand. The room was the kind of quiet that isn't silence but feels like it. The particular attentive stillness of a group of people who understand that what they're about to hear matters. She stated her credentials, her title, her 9 years with Holloway Mead. She walked through the sequence, the flight to Tennessee, the meeting with Landon, the binders on the kitchen table, the call to Marcus, the metadata. She kept her voice level. She had prepared for this by sleeping adequately, which was itself a form of discipline she'd had to work for. When she reached the phone call with Richard Gaines, the question about the forged signature, the non-answer, the close the deal, she heard a sound from the gallery that wasn't quite a murmur, just a shift, the collective adjustment of people receiving information that confirmed what they'd suspected. Richard Gaines, at the opposing table, was looking at the wall to the left of the panel, not at her. Holloway Mead's lead counsel cross-examined her for 31 minutes. He was skilled and prepared, and the line of questioning was exactly what she'd expected. The unauthorized access, the personal relationship with Pierce, the financial interest in killing a project that was no longer serving her career. She answered every question directly. Where the framing was false, she said it was false, and why. Where the implication was accurate, she confirmed it. She did not become emotional, and she did not become cold. She stayed exactly where she'd been, which was in the specific territory of a person who knows what they know and has stopped needing to perform certainty because the actual thing is sufficient. At one point, the lead counsel said, "Isn't it true that you've been residing on or near the Pierce property for the duration of your time in Creston Valley?" She said, "I've been working there. The documentation is there." "You've developed a personal relationship with Mr. Pierce." She looked at the counsel for a moment. Then she said, "I've developed a relationship with the truth of what's in this valley. Mr. Pierce had that truth, and I didn't when I arrived." A pause. "I'd call that an education more than a relationship, though it's been both." The counsel moved on. At the end of her testimony, the panel chair asked if she had anything to add. It was a formality. She'd been told to say no. She said, "Yes." Ellen closed her eyes briefly at the table. Vanessa looked at the panel. "I want the board to understand that none of the evidence in this complaint was manufactured or selectively gathered to serve a personal outcome. I arrived in Creston Valley to buy land for a corporation I worked for and believed in. Everything I've submitted to this board is documentation of what I found when I looked at the actual data. Not because I was looking for a problem, but because the problem was there and I couldn't stop seeing it." She paused. 36 families in this valley depend on the aquifer. That's not an abstraction in the complaint documents. Those are people who cannot turn on a tap and get city water. Their wells are all they have. She looked at the panel chair. I'm not asking for anything that isn't already in the evidence. I'm asking you to read it." She stepped down. The panel recessed for 90 minutes. In the hallway outside the hearing room, Landon stood against the wall with a cup of terrible vending machine coffee and didn't say much. Oliver was at school. Landon had told him that morning, when Oliver had appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas at 6:15, apparently having set an alarm, that he would know the result before Oliver got home, and he would tell him then. Oliver had processed this and said okay and gone back to bed with the equanimity of a child who had learned to trust his father's sense of timing. Ellen was on her phone at the far end of the hallway. Dr. Chandra stood beside her, talking quietly. Vanessa stood near Landon, their arms not quite touching against the wall. "You didn't say no," he said. "No," she agreed. "Ellen's going to have something to say about that." "Probably." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you didn't say no." She looked at him sideways. He was still looking at the opposite wall, the coffee cup in his hand, the ill-fitting suit, the careful collar. The tiredness around his eyes that had been there since she'd met him and was, she thought, not going anywhere soon, but was less now than it had been. "Landon," she said. He turned and looked at her. She held his gaze for a moment. There were things she hadn't said, things that had been building for 3 weeks on a kitchen table covered in evidence and over coffee that started bad and got less bad, and over a child's questions at dinner, and 2 sticks figures holding hands on a refrigerator drawing. Things that weren't about a hearing or a complaint or the next 10 days. "I'll tell you later," she said, "when this is done." He looked at her for another moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "Okay." The doors to the hearing room opened. The panel chair's face gave nothing away, which Vanessa knew from experience meant nothing except that the chair had a good face. They filed back in. The gallery had grown in the recess. More faces from the valley, she noticed, the word having traveled by whatever mechanism words travel in small interconnected communities. The chair waited for quiet. "Based on the evidence submitted," she said, "this board finds substantial basis to conclude that the Meridian Environmental Partners Assessment submitted for the Creston Valley Development Project contained materially falsified data. The development suspension issued last week will be extended indefinitely, pending full criminal investigation by the State Attorney General's office." She looked at the Holloway Mead table. "We are additionally referring this matter to the EPA's Office of Inspector General given the federal funding connection identified in the complaint." A pause. "This board has also voted to formally revoke the conditional environmental clearance issued for this project. That revocation is effective immediately." She set down her paper. The sound from the gallery was not loud. It was the sound of people who had been holding their breath, letting it out all at once, which is its own kind of noise. Landon stood beside Vanessa with his hands at his sides. Richard Gaines, at the opposing table, had finally looked up from the wall. He was looking at the panel chair now, and his face had done the thing she'd wondered about. It had changed. The particular change of a man who has run a calculation for a very long time and has just, in a fluorescent-lit room in Knoxville, Tennessee, watched the math come out wrong. She didn't feel the satisfaction she might have expected. She felt tired in a way that was also clean, the tiredness of something honestly finished. She looked at Landon. He was looking at her. "Well," he said. "Yeah," she said. Mrs. Wynne appeared at Landon's shoulder and took his hand in both of hers, and said something in a voice too low to hear from where Vanessa stood, and Landon's expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. It opened, briefly, fully, without the steadying guard he kept, and he nodded and squeezed the older woman's hands. Vanessa looked away to give him that. She looked at the room, at the people from the valley, at Ellen, who was already back on her phone with the focused energy of someone whose work was just beginning, at the window on the far wall through which she could see nothing but sky. She thought about driving back to the valley tonight, about the farmhouse kitchen with its lamp and its legal pads and its too much mustard sandwiches, about the apple orchard at the property's edge that she hadn't yet seen up close, about things she'd said she would say when this was done. She thought about what it meant to win something you actually wanted. It was a different weight entirely. The drive back from Knoxville took 2 hours and 12 minutes, and for most of it, nobody said much. Ellen had stayed behind to handle the immediate press questions. There were 4 journalists waiting outside the hearing room when the decision came down, which was 4 more than she'd anticipated, and which she handled with the efficient precision of someone who had learned that the story you tell in the first hour shapes everything that comes after. Landon and Vanessa had slipped out the side door with Dr. Chandra, who shook their hands in the parking lot with both of hers and said, "Good work," in the tone of a scientist paying the highest compliment she knew how to pay, which was accuracy without decoration. Landon drove. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat of his truck, which smelled like soil and motor oil, and faintly like the peanut butter crackers Oliver kept in the center console for emergencies. The Tennessee highway unspooled ahead of them, the afternoon turning gold and long the way it did in October when the light came in at an angle and made ordinary things, a grain elevator, a water tower, a rusted billboard for a hardware store, look briefly worth keeping. She had been waiting to feel something specific. Relief, maybe. The particular release of a thing that has been pressing and is now resolved. But what she felt was more complicated and less dramatic than that, the way most real things are. She felt the tiredness she'd told Landon about in the hallway, the kind that comes from doing something honestly. She felt something else underneath it that she didn't have a clean word for. Not happiness exactly, more like rightness, the specific sensation of being in the correct place doing the correct thing, which she had not felt often enough in 9 years to have a well-worn vocabulary for it. She looked at Landon's profile. He was watching the road with both hands on the wheel, and the particular stillness of a person who was doing the same thing she was, processing, silently, in parallel. "Oliver's going to be insufferable about being right," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "About what?" "Everything." She looked out the window. "He told me 3 weeks ago that the truth is heavy, but it's better than putting it down. He said you said that." "I did say that." He delivered it at me very calmly over a bowl of cereal. She paused. "He's 7. It's a lot." The corner of Landon's mouth moved. "He's been doing that since he was 5. Claire used to say he was an old man in a small body." He was quiet for a moment. She would have liked today, not the drama of it. She never cared about drama, but the result. He adjusted his hands on the wheel. She cared very much about water. She used to say that everything worth having is mostly water. People, trees, time. Vanessa held that for a moment without saying anything about it. "She sounds like she was right about most things," she said. Aggressively so. He said it with the specific warmth of someone who has learned to carry love and loss as the same object. It was one of her more irritating qualities. The highway turned into the county road, and the county road turned into the long straightaway that led toward the valley, and the fields came back on both sides, soybeans, then the switched-over harvested rows, then the tree lines. And Vanessa felt the specific feeling she'd noticed developing over the last 3 weeks, the feeling of a landscape becoming recognizable, of knowing what came around the next bend. She thought about the motel in Harwick, with its orange lamp and its cheerless competence, which she had been checking in and out of for 3 weeks now, always intending to leave and not leaving. Her apartment in Chicago was being managed by a friend who watered her 2 plants and collected her mail and sent occasional photos proving the plants were still alive, which was kind and which made Vanessa feel, every time she looked at the photos, the mild indifference of someone who has grown uncertain about whether that particular life fits anymore. She hadn't said that out loud yet. She was going to have to. "Landon," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know what I'm going to say?" "Not exactly." He kept his eyes on the road. "But I know you've been sitting with something since the hallway in Knoxville, and I know it's not about the case." A pause. "And I know the motel room in Harwick has been a fiction for at least 2 weeks." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I don't have a job," she said. "My apartment is in a city I've been paying rent on from 2 states away. My mother's in Phoenix, and she doesn't fully understand what happened except that I quit, which she's been managing badly." She paused. "My whole life is currently fitting in 2 suitcases in a motel room, which is either a crisis or the most clarifying thing that's happened to me in a decade." "Which is it?" She thought about it honestly. "Both," she said. "It's both, and the crisis part is getting smaller." He nodded slowly. I'm not asking you for anything, she said, and meant it. I'm not showing up at your door with a plan. I don't have a plan. I have a suitcase and a professional reputation that is currently either destroyed or rebuilt, depending on which newspaper you're reading, and I have... She stopped. She looked at the road ahead. I have a reason to stay in this valley that I didn't have 2 months ago. Multiple reasons. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she made herself sit with the quiet without filling it. When Oliver was 4, he said, right after Clara died, he went through a phase where he would not sleep unless someone was in the room. Not holding him, not talking to him, just in the room. He kept his eyes on the road. I would sit in the chair by his window for an hour every night, sometimes 2, until he was fully under. And I would sit there in the dark and think about how I was going to do the next 20 years alone, and the thinking would go in circles until I stopped trying to think and just sat. He paused. One night he said from the bed, almost asleep, "Dad, is it okay if things are different now?" And I said yes, and he said good, and went to sleep. A breath. He wasn't asking permission, he was checking that I knew. Vanessa looked at him. Things can be different, he said, simply, without performance. She turned back to the window and looked at the valley coming in around them, the familiar bend, the fence posts, the specific shape of the tree line above the spring. Okay, she said. It was the same word she'd said on the porch that first night, when he'd told her to come back and she'd almost refused out of the habit of not needing things. It meant something different in its second use. Both of them knew that. Oliver was on the porch when they pulled up, which meant he had been watching the driveway. He came down the steps before the truck had fully stopped and stood in the gravel with his hands in his jacket pockets, in the posture of someone who was working very hard at appearing casual. "How did it go?" he said. "We won," Landon said. Oliver processed this. Something moved across his face that he clearly did not intend to be as visible as it was. Relief, enormous and unguarded. The relief of a 7-year-old who has understood more about the stakes than adults have given him credit for. "Okay," he said. Then he went back inside. They followed him in and found him at the kitchen table with a glass of milk and his composition notebook, open to a fresh page, writing something with his left hand in the slow, purposeful way he wrote things he considered important. "What are you writing?" Vanessa asked. "A record," he said, without looking up. "Dad says important things should be written down." She sat across from him. Landon put the kettle on. The kitchen smelled like the end of a long day and the beginning of an ordinary evening, which was, she was learning, the best possible smell. She looked at what Oliver was writing. October 14th. The farm is ours. The water is safe. Vanessa stayed. She looked at the last 2 words. "I haven't officially stayed," she said. He looked up at her. "You're here, aren't you?" She opened her mouth. She closed it. "Okay," she said, for the 3rd time in an afternoon. Oliver went back to his writing with the satisfaction of someone who has correctly documented a fact. The weeks that followed were not neat. She had expected them to be messy, and they were messy in ways she hadn't specifically anticipated, which was itself a kind of education. The criminal investigation moved on its own timeline, which was slower than Ellen had hoped and faster than the opposing counsel had intended. In December, 4 months after the hearing, the state attorney general's office formally charged Richard Gaines with 3 counts of falsifying documents submitted to a regulatory agency and 1 count of fraud in connection with a federally funded project. Meridian Environmental Partners settled with the state for $2.4 million and surrendered their consulting license. Gerald Pruitt was not charged. Ellen had worked hard for that, and it had worked. And Vanessa sent Pruitt an email on the day the charges were announced that said simply, "You did the right thing. I hope it gets easier." He wrote back 2 days later, "It already has. A little. Thank you for calling." Richard Gaines's trial was set for the following spring. Vanessa would be called as a witness. She had been prepared for this by Ellen, and by the months between the hearing and the trial date, and by the specific kind of preparation that comes from having already done the hardest version of the thing. Standing up in a public room and saying what you know to be true, regardless of the cost. The trial would be easier than the hearing. Not easy. Easier. Patricia Dunn, her employment attorney in Chicago, settled the wrongful termination claim with Holloway Mead's board of directors for a figure that covered Vanessa's immediate financial runway without making her rich, which was what she'd asked for. She hadn't wanted to be made rich by it. She'd wanted to be able to take the time to build something real, which was a different request and one that Patricia had looked at her for a moment about, before nodding and adjusting the demand letter accordingly. Her mother called on a Thursday in November, which was 3 weeks after the case had been in the national press, and said, "I've been reading about what you did," in the tone of a woman who had opinions she was organizing. "I know," Vanessa said. "You could have lost everything." "I know that too." A pause. "Are you happy?" Vanessa looked out the kitchen window of the farmhouse. She was at the farmhouse. She was always at the farmhouse. The motel room in Harwick was finally, genuinely vacated. At the bare winter field and the tree line and the thin silver line of the spring catching the low November light. "I'm getting there," she said. "It's happening in the right direction." Her mother was quiet for a moment, then, "Your father used to say that the only thing worse than failing at the wrong thing was succeeding at it." Vanessa had not heard this before. "He said that?" "Many times." A pause. "I didn't know what he meant until just now talking to you." Another pause, shorter. "Tell me about the farm." So she did. She told her about the valley and the aquifer and the spring at the tree line. She told her about Oliver and the excavator drawing and the boots that were too large and the Brontosaurus shirt. She told her about Landon, carefully, honestly, without the rehearsed brevity she usually applied to things that mattered. She told her about the kitchen table and the legal pads and the 47 deals and the one question she'd never asked. Her mother listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual, and when Vanessa finished, there was a silence on the line that was the particular silence of a parent absorbing the fact that their child has become someone. "I want to meet them," her mother said. "You will," Vanessa said. "Soon." "Soon," she agreed. She found work in January, not all at once, but in pieces, the way rebuilding tends to happen. A conservation land trust in Nashville reached out after seeing her name in the case coverage. They were looking for someone who understood both land acquisition and environmental regulation, and they used the phrase rare combination in the email, which made her almost laugh because it was accurate and she'd never thought to describe herself that way. She took a consulting arrangement first, then a more formal role as the Trust's Director of Acquisition Strategy, which was the same title she'd held at Holloway Mead and entirely different in every way that mattered. The work meant Nashville twice a week and the Valley the rest of the time, which was an arrangement that required her to finally, formally, establish herself somewhere other than a motel room. She rented a small house in Harwick, 2 bedrooms, a porch, a yard with 3 old oak trees, and a garden bed that had been neglected for years and was calling to her in the specific way neglected things call to people who've recently learned to stop walking past them. She planted it in March. Badly, at first, because she had no real experience and relied on Oliver's specific and surprisingly detailed knowledge of what grew in Tennessee clay soil. Knowledge he delivered in the authoritative tone of a child who has absorbed things by proximity and takes quiet pride in their expertise. "Tomatoes need more sun than you think," he told her, standing in her garden on a Saturday afternoon with his boots on and his hands in his pockets. "And you planted the beans too close to the squash. They'll fight." "How do you know that?" "My mom planted beans," he said. Matter of fact, without the particular weight it might have carried 6 months ago, not because the weight was gone, but because he'd learned, at 7 and then 8, to carry it in a way that let him keep moving. "She had a garden book. I still have it." Vanessa looked at him. "Would you be willing to lend it to me?" He thought about it with genuine seriousness. "Yes," he said. "But you have to give it back." "I will. And if you spill anything on it, I won't spill anything on it." He seemed to decide she was trustworthy. "Okay," he said, and went back to assessing her squash spacing with the air of a consultant who had additional concerns. The garden grew, imperfectly. The tomatoes did better than she expected. The beans and the squash sorted themselves out with more conflict than Oliver had predicted, but ultimately more yield than she'd hoped. She learned things slowly and made mistakes that were the useful kind, the kind that cost you a plant or a season and teach you something that sticks. It was April when Landon's bar reinstatement came through. Ellen had helped him with the application, which had been submitted in October and had moved through the Tennessee Bar's review process with the particular speed of an application accompanied by a public record of significant environmental law work done in service of the public interest. The Bar's reinstatement committee had, according to Ellen, used the phrase compelling circumstances twice in the approval letter, which was the committee's version of enthusiasm. He told Vanessa on a Tuesday evening, setting the letter on the kitchen table between them the way he set most significant things, without announcement, letting it be there. She read it and looked up at him. He was looking at the letter, not at her, with the expression she'd learned to read over months, the internal one, the one that meant he was letting something in slowly, carefully, not because he was reluctant, but because he'd learned that things let in too fast sometimes broke what they were supposed to fill. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I've been holding my breath for 2 years and just figured out I can stop." He looked at her then. "Scared? Of practicing again? Of caring about it again?" He paused. "When you care about work the way I cared about it, the way I cared about Clara, the way I care about this valley, you're exposed. Something can take it." He looked at the letter. "I know that now in a way I didn't know it before." "You're going to do it anyway," she said. "Yes," quietly. "I think I've been doing it anyway since October. The bar reinstatement is just the paperwork." She thought about what he'd said the night before the hearing in the hallway. "I've been ready for this for 2 years. I just didn't know what it was going to look like." She thought about how that was true of more than the hearing, and how he probably knew that, and how some things take their time being said even when both people can see them. "I have something to tell you," she said. He waited. "The Conservation Trust offered me a full-time position." She paused. "Nashville-based, but the work is spread across the state. A lot of it would be in this region." She looked at the table. "It's not what I expected to be doing at 30. It pays about 60% of what I made before." She looked up at him. "It's the first job offer I've received that didn't make me want to calculate the exit timeline before I'd finished reading the offer letter." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're staying," he said. Not a question this time. "I live in Harwick," she said. "I have a garden. I borrowed Clara's garden book." She paused and felt the particular weight of saying Clara's name in this context, the importance of not moving past it, of letting it be what it was, a life that had existed and mattered and still existed in the things it had left behind. "I have a garden book that Oliver lent me very seriously and which I am being very careful with." She met his eyes. "I'm staying." He reached across the table in the way he sometimes did, not reaching for her hand so much as reaching for the fact of her, the concrete reality of her being there, and she met him halfway, which was the only honest way to meet anyone. They sat like that for a moment in the kitchen with the April evening coming through the window. The particular green light of early spring in Tennessee, the valley doing what it had always done, persisting, patient, holding the water beneath it that 36 families depended on, that a spring at a tree line expressed with the steady clarity of something that has been true for longer than anyone currently living could remember. "There's one more thing," she said. "Okay." "Oliver knows," she said. "He's known for weeks. He's been waiting for us to catch up." Landon was quiet for a moment. Then, "He put it in the record book, didn't he?" "Vanessa stayed," she confirmed. "Back in October." He exhaled through his nose in a way that was almost a laugh. "Of course he did." "He's not wrong." "No," Landon said. "He's not." The apple orchard was at the northeast corner of the property, which Vanessa had walked past many times over the winter, and had not gone into for reasons she understood, but hadn't examined closely. It was the orchard Oliver had mentioned that first morning, the one that held Clara's ashes, and there was something about that knowledge that had made her keep a respectful distance without being asked to. In April, after the bar reinstatement letter and the conversation that followed it, Landon asked her if she wanted to see it. They went on a Saturday morning, the three of them, Oliver running ahead in the way he ran everywhere, slightly too fast, coat open despite the chill, completely at home in the landscape in the way of children who have been a specific place long enough for it to be interior geography rather than just location. The orchard was maybe 24 trees, old ones, the bark thick and furrowed, the spring blossoms just beginning, white and pink, tentative in the April cold, the specific bravery of things that bloom before they can be sure the frost is done. Oliver walked between the trees with his hands touching the bark of each one in passing, a ritual that was clearly old and personal and that he didn't explain, which she didn't ask him to. Landon walked beside her. She planted 7 of these, he said, the younger ones, on the east side. She did it the second spring we lived here. She said every piece of land you live on should have something you planted on it. He looked at the trees. She was right. She was almost always right, which I've mentioned. Aggressively so, Vanessa said. He looked at her sideways. Right. They stood among the blossoms for a while, the 3 of them, in the way that people stand in places that hold things. Not solemnly, not performing reverence, but quietly present in the particular way that some places require. Oliver came to stand beside his father and leaned against him in the unself-conscious way of a child who has always known that particular shoulder, and Landon put his arm around him without looking down, the automatic fluency of 2 people who have been each other's main thing for long enough that the gestures are below thought. Vanessa thought about what Oliver had written in his record book. The farm is ours. The water is safe. Vanessa stayed. 3 facts. The 3 facts that mattered. A 7-year-old's precision, which was sometimes the sharpest kind. She thought about the 47 deals and the things she'd never stopped to ask. She thought about the flight to Tennessee with the project file and the certainty she'd carried onto the plane like luggage and left behind somewhere between the gravel driveway and the first cup of bad coffee at the kitchen table. She thought about what she'd said to the state panel. Those are people who cannot turn on a tap and get city water, and how she'd meant it not as rhetoric but as the plainest possible statement of what she'd seen. She thought about what it costs to look at something directly. Not the looking itself. The looking is just opening your eyes. The cost is in what you have to do once you've seen. Some people don't pay it. She understood that now without judgment, because she'd been one of them for 9 years. And the absence of judgment was itself something she'd had to learn, something the valley and the kitchen table and the man standing beside her with his arm around his son had taught her the way most real things get taught, gradually, imperfectly, in the accumulation of ordinary days. She had not arrived in Creston Valley looking for a life. She had arrived looking for acreage. What she'd found instead was the specific kind of reckoning that comes when the world shows you something true and you can't figure out how to look away from it, so you stop trying. She understood now that the story she'd been telling herself about success, 47 deals, 0 losses, the credentials she led with in rooms full of people who needed to know she was formidable, was not a lie exactly, but it was a story missing its second half. The first half was, I am very good at what I do. The missing second half was, what I do should be worth being good at. She was working on the second half now. It was slower. The margins were different. The satisfaction was more durable and arrived less loudly and was, for that, worth more. Dad, Oliver said from under Landon's arm, can we plant another tree? Landon looked down at him. What kind? I don't know. He looked at the blossoms. Something that takes a long time to grow. He said it with the logic of a child who had understood something about time and patience that most adults arrived at much later, and some not at all. So we'll always be here to see it. Landon was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. We can do that. Oliver nodded, satisfied, and went back to touching the bark of trees. Landon looked at Vanessa. She looked back at him in the cool April light, in the orchard with its old trees and its new blossoms, and the specific weight of everything the ground here held, and she thought, this is what it looks like when you finally win something you actually wanted. It doesn't look like triumph. It looks like an ordinary Saturday morning with blossoms coming in and a child asking to plant something that will take a long time to grow. It looks like staying. What kind of tree? She asked. Landon thought about it. Pear tree takes about 15 years to produce well. Oliver will be 23. Yes. She looked at the east row of trees, the ones Clara had planted, the younger bark, the same blossoms. Let's plant 2, she said. 1 for each of us. Landon looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face that she had seen before, that she had stopped finding hard to read. The door opening, fully this time, without the careful inch by inch of a person protecting something newly healed. Just open. Okay, he said. The same word, the third use for her now. It had been gathering meaning each time it was spoken between them, the way words do when the right people say them. Not changing definition but deepening, the way a riverbed deepens over time, worn smooth and true by everything that has passed through it. The valley held the morning around them. The spring at the tree line ran clear. The aquifer beneath their feet did what aquifers do. Pressed upward, patient, sustaining, indifferent to the things people built above it, and faithful to the things that needed it to survive. In Nashville, Ellen Marsh was preparing the final documentation for the Gaines trial. In Knoxville, Carol Thibodeau was writing her formal report to the state legislature on regulatory gaps exposed by the Creston Valley case, gaps that, once addressed, would make it harder for the next Richard Gaines to move a boundary line on a map and call it science. In a small office in Nashville, a conservation land trust was waiting for their new director of acquisition strategy to show up on Monday and begin the work of protecting land the right way, with honesty about what was there and respect for what depended on it. All of that was true. All of it would continue. But on this particular Saturday morning, none of it was the most important thing. The most important thing was an 8-year-old running between apple trees, touching the bark of each one as he passed, counting them without counting, keeping the record of a place he had been promised he would never have to leave. The most important thing was a man who had come home after losing everything and had found that home, tended carefully, was still itself. Still the place that held what he'd loved and still capable of holding new things without forgetting the old ones. The most important thing was a woman who had flown into a valley to buy it and had ended up, after the longest and most honest 2 months of her life, understanding that some places don't sell. Some places teach. She didn't know everything that came next. She knew she would make mistakes in this new life the way she'd made mistakes in the garden, some recoverable, some not, all of them instructive. She knew there would be days when the smallness of a life in a valley felt like loss rather than liberation, because that was the truth of choosing something real over something impressive, and pretending otherwise was the kind of lie she'd given up. She knew Oliver would grow up and become someone she couldn't fully predict, which was exactly right and which she was already, quietly, looking forward to. She knew Landon would have hard days. Grief doesn't keep a schedule and it doesn't ask for permission, and she would be there for those days in whatever way she could be, imperfectly, honestly, showing up. That was enough. It was she had learned more than enough. It was everything. She stood in the orchard with the blossoms coming in and the valley around them and the spring running clear at the tree line, and she thought about what it means to stop performing a life and begin living one, about what it costs, about what it returns. About a 6-word question she had never thought to ask until a man in work boots asked it of her at a kitchen table, over bad coffee, in a house she now knew the smell of and the light of and the weight of. What happened to the land? She knew now. She would keep knowing. She would spend the rest of her working life making sure the answer was something she could say out loud. The blossoms moved in the April wind, white and pink and tentative and certain, the way beginnings always are, unsure of the weather, sure of themselves. Oliver called from the far end of the orchard. "Can we have lunch after this?" "Yes," Landon called back. "Can Vanessa make the sandwiches?" Landon looked at her. She looked at him. "I put too much mustard," she said. "I know," he said. "He likes too much mustard." "I know that too." His voice was quiet and even and full of something she'd stopped trying to name because it had become simply the sound of where she was. She raised her voice toward the trees. "Yes, I'll make the sandwiches." Satisfied footsteps in the fallen leaves. The morning continuing, the valley holding everything it held. She was no longer visiting. She was home.